But let me just show you one thing. Have you ever seen? Can you see this book I'm holding up?
Open Corporation.
Yeah. Have you ever seen it?
I've heard it because I studied Larouche a bit, but I never read it.
This has about 40 pages on the Kennedy assassination, going back into the whole network that Joe Kennedy came from, the Papa. And that's the network of the Bronfman family, and it's from Bronfman that you get Louis Mortimer Bloomfield.
Okay.
So it's definitely worth looking at if you can find it somewhere.
Can you show the cover more in front of the camera that the audience can see it? Because we just saw the title, but not the cover.
Is that better?
Okay. This is the okay. This is the Queen of the English monarchy symbol.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just a personal point of view. It's sad because I believe I'm the maybe few French remember what I will talk about, but I'm sure you're 100% okay with what I'm gonna say. In the last interview, the first part, you said that there are some French politicians that claim to be the legacy of de Gaulle, involved in the legacy of de Gaulle. You named Jacques Chirac as a pale copy of de Gaulle, in fact, and you were right on this. But you also mentioned Sarkozy. So
no, I didn't. I don't think Sarkozy has any connection to de Gaulle.
We understand it.
Because if I said that, it was a mistake.
No. Actually, you said some people claim to be.
Okay.
But everybody understood because I had the good translation. So you said Sarkozy wasn't, in fact, even if he claimed to such thing, is not a legacy of de Gaulle. But I want to go further in this because it's really interesting. And you will correct me if you're not okay, if you disagree. De Gaulle, in his era, saved the French gold from the robbery organized by the US government. I believe it was under Nixon, with the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The gold dollar became the oil dollar. And all the gold of the people that were involved in this have been robbed at this period by the US government, basically. And de Gaulle saw this and preserved the French gold. But once Sarkozy was Minister of Economy under Jacques Chirac in 2004, what he did is sold this gold to the US government for nothing. And I just want to expose to the audience why Sarkozy did this. Because in my opinion, if you look at the origin of the political movement of Sarkozy, who is a parallel movement to May 68 in France, not completely involved in May 68, but really parallel. Those guys have been educated to kill the de Gaulle monetary system, in fact, and to replace it. So when you said that Jacques Chirac was a pale copy of de Gaulle, you were completely right, because what Chirac hid, I don't know if it's an appropriate word, but I'm sure you understand, he hid Sarkozy. And this is sad because Chirac, with Putin, was against the Iraq war. And once Chirac was ejected because he had 2 terms and he cannot do a third one, the problem is the French voted for Sarkozy, who was in fact the Trojan horse of what we are criticizing to the US government, because he made the job in Libya for the US government with the same colonialist ideology. Because I believe that May 68 and Woodstock produced the same politician in the United States of America. They perverted through Woodstock the legacy of the 60s and of Kennedy, and that brings Obama, in fact. He claimed to be a direct heritage of Kennedy, but he was like Sarkozy, a mimetic movement that was here to destroy this heritage. And in France, you had Sarkozy to match with Bush, and you had Hollande to match with Obama. And those guys have nothing to do with de Gaulle or Kennedy. They are under version that pervert the heritage of the 60s, claiming to be direct in link. That's why I said it's sad to see that the anti-communism of those era is become, to nowadays, the anti-Russia rhetoric, but nothing has changed. Are you okay with this?
Well, I would add one point, which is that as you know from the discussion the other day, our view is that these policies come from British geopolitics. And there's a long tradition after World War II of the British having a very significant influence on French policy, which did not happen with de Gaulle. De Gaulle had the old view of perfide Albion. He did not like the British. But if you look at the effect after Nixon, when the dollar was taken off the gold reserve, I believe it was Maurice Allais, who was an advisor to de Gaulle, who said that this is going to destroy the potential for Europe because it turns Europe into a house of speculation. Now, that's what the real Gaullists believed. In that sense, Chirac, with his negotiations with Helmut Schmidt for the European Monetary Fund, was somewhat closer to de Gaulle's view, and Larouche had a lot to say about that was getting into the hands of Chirac and Schmidt. On the other hand, the people who replaced them, and in particular Sarkozy, and in Germany you had Helmut Kohl actually was trying to do some things that were not wrong, but he was weak. And the government after him of Merkel has been a disaster. But it's the British influence. If you go back to the Iraq War and also Libya, the British were the ones who were pushing this even harder than the US. Sir Richard Dearloffe, the head of MI6, was the one who came up with the dossier, which claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that could hit London in 45 minutes without warning. That was what was used by Colin Powell when he gave his presentation to the United Nations. On Libya, it was the British who were pushing really hard, along with Hillary Clinton, and the French came along with them. But it was the old effort of the Anglo-French alliance, which has never been good for France. And so I think any leader in France who's too closely tied to the British view is going to sell out the actual sovereign interests of the nation of France.
Yeah, but because there is a frustration for many French nowadays, because once Chirac disappeared, and the French were proud that Jacques Chirac was against the Iraq War, but we've been insulted as pigs or wine drinkers, when Bush staged this war. And Chirac was right, but he wasn't strong enough to prevent the French from Sarkozy, in fact. He was a Trojan horse for this ideology. Yeah. And we're still waiting for apology, but this is sad because there is nobody waiting for those apology, because it seems that the French completely follow the movement after the Bush era, that the Obama continue. And
that's the problem with NATO. If you look at NATO, it's essentially dominated by British American interests. And now what I find very fascinating is that Trump is not so keen on NATO. He doesn't like NATO. And in particular, it's because of Ukraine. He doesn't think that the U.S. should be brought into these wars, such as a Ukraine-Russia war. And this has a lot to do with the impeachment hearing that's going on, and also the big fuss in London right now with the NATO 70th anniversary summit, where Trump and Sarkozy had a little bit of a dust-up, a little bit of a fight. But interestingly, what they both agreed on is bringing Russia back into the G8 and having the negotiations, the Normandy 4 negotiations with Putin, to bring an end to the Ukraine fighting. So I think, and I don't trust Macron at all on this.
It is a continuation of what you are criticizing.
Yeah, but I think he's being forced because of domestic problems to pretend he's coming up with a solution, whereas Merkel is continuing to go 100% with the British policy of keep the sanctions against Russia, even while trying to make the deal on the Nord Stream 2.
Yeah, but I want to go back specifically on this Iraq war, because what image the United States of America shown to the world by having a president like George Bush that can start a war based on false accusation with millions of people that died because of this, and finish after his 2 term in United States of America in a talk show, filming his feet with his cell phone, or you got Tony Blair. Even this guy, I'm sure he influenced the Bush on the wrong direction
Very
because
big
of the influence of the Great Britain over the United States of America. This guy is paid a lot of money by private financial companies, and what the image give the Anglo-Saxon world by don't prosecute those two guys for crimes against humanity and allow them to get along with what they did. Everybody knows that they lied. Everybody knows that this war was completely a fake movement. But where is the justice? Where are the adults in the United States of America? We see that the behavior of the Democrats, it seems that they only have in the politics rotten children that act like crazy people. Where are the adults on this?
Let me tell you, much of this is the legacy of the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination, because you had secret networks in the intelligence community that carried out an assassination, that covered it up, and with the connivance of a friendly press, were able to continue to tell a story that very few Americans believe, but it made people feel impotent. And just on the Iraq situation, let's go back to the beginning of this. You had Bush as vice president pushing the United States to arm the so-called Afghansi against the Soviets in Afghanistan. This is the origin of the bin Laden network, what became Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That was Bush as vice president who was doing that. Then Bush as president, the older Bush, went into war with Iraq over Kuwait based on lies. And,
yeah, I remember that.
And who was pushing that? Bush Sr. was not so interested in going to war initially, and Thatcher, in her autobiography, said, I came over and stiffened his spine and got him to commit to the war. And then Clinton, Bill Clinton, continued the sanctions that led to the deaths of, some say, 500,000 Iraqi children. That was Bill Clinton, the great peace lover. And then George W. Bush and Dick Cheney gobbled up the intelligence presented to them, the lying intelligence from Britain, including that Saddam was buying yellow cake uranium from Niger and so on. And as a result, we had the Iraq War. Obama continued the policy, and then the regime change with Libya, the attempt to get rid of Assad in Syria, which they say cost 400,000 lives, which the West blames on Assad. But those people weren't dying until the West started arming jihadists who carried out attacks that the Syrian army had to counter. So if you look at the modern period, what you see is a legacy of the lies and the cover-up that were done to make sure that people didn't know what happened to John Kennedy or why. And so I think it's, and then you mentioned before Ukraine, the same networks, the people who are now saying that Trump had a quid pro quo, that he wanted to personally benefit by having Ukraine smear Biden. These people pretend that they're supporters of Ukraine, yet they're the ones who brought in the International Monetary Fund that destroyed Ukraine from 1991 to 2013, and then that worsened the situation after the coup at Maidan. And interestingly, the same kind of Nazi networks that were used by the U.S. State Department and U.S. intelligence community to overthrow the Yanukovych regime in Ukraine, those are the same kind of fascist elements that were recruited by Allen Dulles and James Jesus Angleton after World War II to provide a strike force inside Europe, which became known as Operation Gladio, which is minimally a peripheral player in the Kennedy assassination, and it may very well be that those networks provided the shooters. So we see a continuity of behavior that includes Nazis, it includes bankers, it includes money launderers, it includes lying media. And this is why they're so angry at Trump, not because Trump is such a great guy, but because Trump is saying, why should Americans go to war and be killed for the purposes of defending this financial system, which doesn't benefit the American people?
I agree with you. What is very shocking is when you got some people like George Soros, who are Jews and are not supposed to go with the neo-Nazis. And that is also a shocking part, that among those, you get a movement into the Jew, Jews are not all the same people, but you got some people involved in those movements that are Jews. There are some Jews that match with this. This is shocking in some way.
Well, you talk about the Kennedy assassination, you're talking about Bloomfield, you're talking about the Bronfman networks, Tibor Rosenbaum, who was one of the funders of these networks. But it's partly because some of the prominent international bankers were Jewish. It's not that Jews ran it. The idea that there's a Jewish conspiracy running the world is absurd, because where did the Rothschilds get their power from initially? It came from the monarchy. It came from the old families that used them to carry out the policy of usury, which was, according to Christianity, is a sin. But it's not a sin in Judaism, so you hire a Jewish banker to do the dirty work.
I agree with you, but this is important for the audience. I will try to explain a little. It's like for the Catholic. Inside the Catholic movement, you got guys like McCarthy, who was completely into this anti-communism hysteria, and you get Catholic like Kennedy. But it is the same for the Jews. You get Jews that are split in those kind of movement. You have Eastern European background, and yet you're not anti-Russia. But you got some Jews, like I saw the Rob Reiner, the director of the good movie Misery, is pushing on the media against Russia, because it seems that he has an anger from the past, because the situation must have been really hard for the Jew into the East, I suppose, because the way some people are pushing for war against Russia is just surprising.
Well, I think when you're talking about this question, there are a couple of other things that are involved, and one of them is Zionism. And Zionism has nothing to do with the religion of Judaism. Okay. The people who became Zionists were largely funded by British elite who wanted to set up a Jewish state in the Middle East, not because they were upset about Jews being persecuted, but because, for the same reason, they backed the Al Saud family to take over the Arabian Peninsula instead of the family of Sharif Hussein. They chose certain elements as they redrew the map. And remember, who was it who redrew the map of the Middle East in the early 1900s? It was the Sykes-Picot Treaty. It was the French and the British. And the French were given a few spoils here in Lebanon and part of Syria, in return for accepting the British becoming the replacement for the Ottoman Empire. And what was the real issue then? This is where we're getting to the core of everything, Boris. It wasn't oil, because oil didn't become so important until a little bit later, and we didn't know how much oil there was in the Middle East. It was land routes versus sea routes. The British were terrified that the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, would bring Eurasia together against the control of the British and their seaports and their deep blue sea navy. And so this is what geopolitics is all about. How could the British pit the French against the Germans and the Germans against the Russians? How could they manipulate to create a World War I, where you essentially had three empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, fighting over the same area, which in the Balkans. This is just classic British geopolitics. And what I find fascinating, going back and reviewing my notes on the Kennedy assassination, is that Kennedy was an opponent of any empire, but especially the British Empire. And it's important because his father admired the British Empire. His father wanted his kids to marry into British nobility. His daughter, Kathleen, married into the Devonshire family. Joe Kennedy was so pro-British when he was the ambassador to Britain in the 30s that Roosevelt had to pull him back, because Kennedy was part of what was called the Cliveden set, which was a pro-Hitler movement inside the British aristocracy. And so that's where John Kennedy came from, that background. But in the 50s, he turned against it. He gave speeches against colonialism in Africa. He was opposed to the idea of using U.S. military force to impose colonial policies. And when he became president, and saw this grouping that was a London Wall Street grouping running his policy with the Bay of Pigs, which nearly got us into a war with Cuba in 1961, who did he turn on? He turned on the CIA, the intelligence community. He fired Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA. Cabell, who was the deputy head of the CIA. He said he wanted to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And then as that elite was moving the United States into the Vietnam War and continued provocations against the Soviet Union, we had the Cuba Missile Crisis, which nearly resulted in a nuclear war. And at that point, Kennedy broke with the geopoliticians. Kennedy he gave this famous speech in Washington, I think it was at American University or maybe George Washington, where he spoke about, do we not breathe the same air? Do we not have the same goals for our children as the Russians? And it was a very profound statement of a president reaching out to Russia, saying, let's end this insanity. And so when he formed a back channel to Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis and continued that, this was seen as a total threat. And the British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Macmillan, wrote in his memoirs, it was at that point that we lost our Jack. In other words, the British no longer could control Kennedy. And they also were terrified that Kennedy was moving against the private central banking system. In June 1963, Kennedy issued an order, Executive Order 11110, where he said, we're going to issue treasury notes the same way Alexander Hamilton had done to defeat the British sabotage, economic warfare against the United States after the American Revolution. Kennedy did that because the Federal Reserve was not making credit available to the steel industry. So Kennedy broke on economic policy. He broke on strategic policy, on policy toward Russia. He was, now I can't say 100% that he wouldn't have continued something in Vietnam, but he was definitely questioning it. And it was at that point that the decision was made to kill him. And so that was a turning point in world history, because we had a president who was acting in the tradition of the founding fathers of an America as a sovereign nation, which nevertheless, as a sovereign nation, was not going to impose its will on every other nation. And the Americans after World War II were chosen by the British to reinforce the principles of the British Empire. Franklin Roosevelt fought against it, but Truman went along with it. And so we've had a fight in the United States since the end of World War II with the British Empire, where the British have had the upper hand most of the time. But
now I want to take a look more specifically with the methodology, because people seem to have some difficulty to identify the methodology. You correct me if you disagree. When they killed Kennedy, they used an ONE and CIA agent named Oswald, who was in fact an anti-castrist, but in the media they staged him as a Marxist and a pro-Castro. They used this guy that they betrayed as a patsy to blame the KGB and the pro-Russian movement in the assassination, while Kennedy was trying to make peace with Russia. This methodology with the inversion in the mind of the collective people is something that is very, to me, it looked like Satanism kind of trick, or, when they killed the brother of Kennedy, they used a so-called pro-Palestinian fake killer, and while in fact there was a cop behind Robert Kennedy that shoot behind him, and they blame the pro-Palestinian, and this referred to a program in the CIA of manipulation of the mind, and when you compare to Ukraine, there is a lot to say with this kind of methodology. What do you think about this?
Well, I think you're right. I think the case of Oswald himself is a very interesting one. And I had the advantage of getting to meet Marina Oswald many years later. And she confirmed a lot of these things about how he was, she wasn't political at the time, but afterwards she became political. Her She drank 4 pots of coffee a day. She had stacks of books and articles and his letters all over the house. And what she said is that she found out that he was not what they said he was, that he was supposedly a communist who was recruited to communism when he went to Russia, or even before that. He had studied Russian in the military, and there's this whole story, a whole cover story of Oswald as a pro-communist, and we mentioned the Castro connection. The Fair Play for Cuba, which was pro-Castro, and the anti-Cuban operation in New Orleans was run out of the same building. Yeah. And Guy Bannister, a high-level FBI operative, was running both sides.
He was from Chicago at the beginning. He was from the FBI of Chicago. He was so-called a former agent of the FBI. He was still involved in it.
Yeah, of course he was. And he had people around him like David Ferrie, who's very significant in the Kennedy assassination. Bannister was tied to the networks of Clay Shaw and Permindex. So what you had was, you create a kind of a miasma, a fog, that is hard to pierce for the average person. It gets too complicated. Was Oswald pro-Castro or anti-Castro? Why did he go to Mexico, the Russian embassy in Mexico City, when it turns out that probably wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald who went? It was part of the cover story that was being created. You create then phony conspiracy theories that are designed to throw people off the trail by becoming more and more bizarre, when the reality is fairly straightforward. Kennedy was prepared to go against the British Empire, and including its deep penetration of the U.S. intelligence community. And this is where, if you look at the networks behind Oswald and behind the assassination, what you find is this character, Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who was in the Special Operation Executive of the British Empire in World War II, the secret operation of the British, but also worked with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA. Bloomfield worked very closely with a man named Sir William Stevenson, who is famous because of the code breaking of the Nazis during World War II. He was codenamed a man called Intrepid. There's a book about him. Yeah.
By the way, Clay Shaw and Bloomfield were coming from the Churchill circle, both of them.
Yeah, exactly. But I want to just go through this importance of where Bloomfield came from, because Sir William Stevenson was the one who went in during World War II and reorganized U.S. intelligence, largely through the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is a long-standing British connection in the United States, going back to the works of Alfred Thayer Mahon, who wrote the famous book, The Influence of Sea Power in History, which claims that God made Britain the greatest power in the world because of their location and the fact they didn't have that many raw materials, so they had to become a sea power. Mahon was trying to influence U.S. policy. At the same time, Mackinder was developing the geopolitical theory in the early 1900s. So Stevenson comes out of that grouping. How do you keep the United States as a dumb muscle on a British leash? And so Stevenson organized networks in the OSS, and he was at odds with William Donovan, who was actually Roosevelt's choice to run the OSS and then the CIA, but Donovan didn't continue. But the Stevenson networks did. And the two key people in that were Allen Dulles and then later James Jesus Angleton. They were the ones who were in Europe during World War II and Switzerland, Dulles was, organizing the Rat Line, the escape of the Nazis at the end of World War II. And these were the networks that were used to build up assassination teams inside NATO countries, especially to target the Greek situation, the Italian situation, even in France, where they feared that the communists, who were briefly in power, I believe, in 1947 in a popular front, they were targeted by what was called the Lovestone networks. Lovestone was another CIA operative who was deployed into the Union movement. So This is what you're talking about, methodology. This is it. You get people who proclaim to be patriots of a country or supporters of a country who are actually supporting something which goes against the interests of that country, but goes in favor of control by a supranational or globalist. Today we call them globalists, but then they were called supranational or anti-sovereigntists. That's the networks that were used to get Kennedy. Now, Bloomfield had a special role because he was the attorney for the Bronfman interests. The Bronfman family was one of the big bootleggers during the Prohibition period. They became very wealthy, operating out of Canada, out of Buffalo, New York. And most of American organized crime, the famous Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, the Purple Gang in Detroit, all of them were part of this British operation because they were getting their booze. Some of it was made in the backyard, but a lot of it was coming from Britain. That's where Joe Kennedy got his booze. And the Bronfmans set up a national organized crime network, which included sports gambling, it included sports services all over the country. Now, this is important because the CIA used these networks. Lucky Luciano was sent to Sicily before the US troops invaded to clear the way with the Sicilian mafia. Lansky and others were involved in money laundering, which was shared, as with this guy Tybar Rosenbaum and others, shared with building up the Mossad, building up the Israeli economy as an ally of this British force. So Bloomfield's role was to create within American intelligence a grouping that was completely sympathetic and literally controlled by British ideology. That's what he did. Now, part of that then, in 1958, they created a company called Permindex, Permanent Industrial Exposition. And it was connected to the World Trade Center in Rome, Bern, Switzerland, Montreal, and then eventually in New Orleans. Clay Shaw, who, as you correctly pointed out, knew Bloomfield for years, they were at the OSS together. He was Colonel Clay Shaw, was his title, was the head of this in New Orleans. And this was identified by the French, I think it was in the mid-60s, maybe it was as late as 67, but the Permindex was the source of a minimum of $200,000 that went to one assassination attempt against de Gaulle that they tracked. And French intelligence concluded that many of the attempts to kill de Gaulle were funded through this same network. And that came to some extent out of Rome. This guy, William Harvey, who was an FBI, CIA operative in Rome, who was controlling assassination squads. But it was also Angleton. It was Dulles. And this is what Bloomfield worked on when he created this network out of New Orleans. And one of the people involved in it was the former Hungarian Prime Minister Nagy. And there's a letter from him asking the CIA if they would be interested in using the services of Permindex at some point in the future. So all of this was what the district attorney in New Orleans, Jim Garrison, investigated when he brought a case against Clay Shaw before, I think in 1967, before the courts, saying that Shaw and Permindex were involved in the Kennedy assassination.
But just, I don't want to make any mistake, but I believe that the assassination attempt against de Gaulle was in 62.
Yeah, it was in 62. But I'm saying that the French intelligence did their study and came out with a report in either 65 or 67, identifying this network. That's what I meant.
And with Bloomfield, we have the Canadian networks that not only were involved in the assassination of JFK, but also Martin Luther King and his brother, in fact, with some assassin exfiltration and weapon, in fact.
Yes, exactly. And also, as we talked about last time, Enrico Mattei, the head of Eni, the Italian oil company, whose plane was sabotaged, I think in 62 he died, at a point when he was serving as a back channel to work with the Russians. So again, it's the same targeting. And just to make the point again that you were bringing up earlier, this is the same issue behind Ukraine. You know, the Yanukovych, you know, he was a flawed figure. He was not a great leader, but he was not only pro-Putin. He was talking to the EU. He wanted a balance for Ukraine. And the idea that Yanukovych was a Putin puppet and Paul Manafort, who later was the Trump campaign manager and is now rotting away in prison unjustly, that Manafort was there to help steer Yanukovych to Moscow is a lot of bunk. Ukraine had been destroyed by the International Monetary Fund. And Yanukovych was trying to do something about it, but there was a lot of misery there, and people demonstrated. And in the midst of that demonstration, the National Endowment for Democracy, Soros, the State Department, the US State Department, deployed neo-Nazis with guns to shoot up the Maidan Square in Kiev and blame it on the Yanukovych government.
Can I expose some information, and you just tell me if you have the same information?
Okay.
The whole plot in the Ukraine Gate was started with the CIA came with a lot of money, and they used Facebook and Twitter to manipulate young people and convince them to try to start a revolution. They also convinced civilian people to go on the street, and at this point they dare to talk to ask Putin to convince Yanukovych not to use the army to stop the movement. The idea was the deal was to avoid the bloodbath. And Putin said, okay, I'll do that because I don't want any bloodbath. While he succeeded in convincing Yanukovych, the Occidental side did the opposite of what they promised to Putin. And the Ukrainian pro-Occidental side used sniper to shoot in the back in their own riot. And they blame Yanukovych for this. And this is a pro-Russian gangster has been replaced by a pro-Occidental gangster who was a Trojan horse for Goldman Sachs, basically, and the catastrophic consequences for the Ukraine economy. Do you have the same information?
Oh, yeah, of course. And you know what you're talking about, there were groups called the Azov Battalion, which is openly honoring their mentor, Stefan Bandera, who headed the Ukrainian SS during the Nazi occupation period. The Bandera movement is responsible for more than 100,000 known deaths of Romanians, of Hungarians, Russians, Jews, and others. It may be as many as 800,000, according to some of the figures. The Azov Battalion, which is now, through Podobui and several other people, inserted in Ukraine's security forces. Also, the Pravi Sector, the political party of this movement, is a Nazi ideology marching behind swastikas when they go in the street. And the story that we've gotten on this is that they brought in sharpshooters, including from Georgia, former Russian Georgia, to carry out the assassinations in the Maidan Square, where they killed police and they also killed demonstrators. And they blamed it all on the Yanukovych security forces, who had been told by Yanukovych to stand down and not shoot.
And we cannot forget to point that inside of this, you got the reluctant behavior of the Biden family with the blackmailing of the Ukraine Department of Justice investigating on the back kicks. Can you develop this? Because it can be interesting for the audience too.
Well, here's the key point about Biden. You know, I know everybody's worked up on the Hunter Biden, his son, getting money from an oligarch to work for Burisma, the oil company. And that's pretty, you know, when you have the vice president of a country that you're dependent on send his son in to get almost $70,000 a month to sit on the board of a company that he knows nothing about their business, that's corrupt. But much worse, what was Biden's actual role? He was the Obama administration's point man in Ukraine. He made, by his own admission, 12 or 13 trips to Ukraine. He met with these neo-Nazis. He met with Yatsenyuk and the demonstrators. He worked with Victoria Nuland, who was in the State Department, the neocon who was running this from the U.S. side, and Jeffrey Pyatt, the U.S. ambassador, who you may remember someone caught a cell phone call between Nuland and Pyatt, where Nuland said, Yats is our man. He's the one who has to be brought in, not Klitschko, the boxer. And when they were joking about the EU might not like it, Payet said, fuck the EU. And, you know,
it was Nuland, you're talking about Nuland, right?
Yeah, Nuland and the U.S. ambassador, Jeffrey Payet, had this conversation. Now, why was that not a big story? Why is it not a big story that neo-Nazis were brought in to run the security forces that then carried out the assassinations of the pro-Russian people in the Donbass and in Odessa, where 30-something people were incinerated in a building by these neo-Nazis? So now here's the interesting thing, though, Boris. Trump put some pressure on Ukraine to clean up its act. But at the same time, he's saying to Zelensky, if you talk to Putin, if you start to resolve this, we'll support you. And so the people who are attacking Trump right now don't want peace in Ukraine. And Kolomoisky, who's one of the leading oligarchs in Ukraine, who supported the coup, but then changed his mind and then was the leading funder of Zelensky, said to the New York Times, the people attacking Trump want a war with Russia to the last Ukrainian. So in other words, people in Ukraine are beginning to figure out they're being used. And yet morons and immoral figures like Adam Schiff and Gerald Nadler are trying to impeach Trump by saying that he doesn't have the right to decide whether money for arms should be released or not. That should be left in the hands of the State Department. Well, in the U.S. Constitution, the power is given to the president, who's elected by the people, not long-term department bureaucrats. But if you saw any of the impeachment hearings 3 weeks ago, these guys went before the Congress as though they were the experts and they were the ones who should make policy, not Trump. So this is the same methodology, because if you go back to the Kennedy assassination, what happened after Kennedy died, and you know, some people say Lyndon Johnson was in on it. I don't think so. I think Johnson told the truth when he said he always had the feeling that there were rifles pointed at him. Johnson went ahead and did what they wanted him to do. Now, whether he was in on it before or afterwards, he clearly accepted the cover-up. And he was told by Hale Boggs, a Louisiana congressman who was on the Warren Commission, that the Warren Commission report was a fraud. And Boggs died in a plane crash in Alaska shortly after he made that statement. So Johnson knew that whether he was with it or against it, that he was under fire. Nixon came in, and you know, Nixon was a totally compromised and miserable figure. But it was under pressure when he broke the Bretton Woods agreement and took the dollar off gold. That changed world history because it opened the world to be a speculative casino where people like George Soros could make billions of dollars betting against currencies and destroying people's life. And so this is where we are today, where you have this British imperial faction running the world.
So okay, saying this, according to you, what are the top 5 personality involved in the assassination of Kennedy, and what were their motivation?
Well, if you start with Bloomfield, the motivation was to keep the United States within the policies of the British Empire.
You put him in the first place?
I would put him as operationally in the first place.
Okay.
Now, as to who's calling the shots, that's a different question. For this, you have, well, we don't know the names, but if you look at something that just happened yesterday, it's indicative. The House of Lords put out a report last December saying Trump must not be allowed to have a second term. Now, when Trump came to London this last couple of days for the NATO summit, the same people were out in force saying again, Trump has to be stopped. Now, they don't quote the individuals who say that, but they say members of the House of Lords or influential City of London people. Now, why do they want to stop what Trump is trying to do? They don't want peace. They don't want an end to conflict, just as they didn't want that with Kennedy. Why?
No.
This is what Eisenhower. I'm getting the. If you look at Bloomfield, what does Bloomfield represent? What Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. That's who ultimately called the shots. And what is the military-industrial complex? It's the interlocking corporate boards of directors of financial institutions, the major banks, the major insurance companies, the raw material cartels, the old imperial power. They're the ones who operate through institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London, the Chatham House, which is one of the centers of British intelligence. They're the ones who are the think tanks that operate on behalf of these corporate interests. So I would say that's who tells Bloomfield what to do.
People like Mike Lloyd, you include in it?
Who?
Mike Lloyd.
McCloy, John McCloy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. John McCloy was an operative for the Rockefellers, Chase Manhattan Bank. That's who we're talking about. You look in Sir Richard Dearloffe. Who does he speak for? He speaks for the most wealthy financiers, the Barclays, the Rothschilds, and others. These are the people who have a policy orientation, and they are used to getting their way, and they control political networks. They control intelligence agencies where if political networks get out of control, they send in people to either bribe or blackmail or threaten or kill. That's how they maintain their power. Because they tried it with Trump. They went to him with this Christopher Steele report right after he was elected, James Comey, the FBI director, on January 7th, 2017, before Trump was inaugurated. And he showed him the Steele report, and he said, Mr. President, we have this documentation on you. We've concluded you were put in power by the Russians. And Trump basically said it's not true, and he told Comey that he should drop that. And Comey left the room saying he felt as though this was his J. Edgar Hoover moment. Remember, Hoover tried to blackmail John Kennedy over his affairs. And he tried to do the same thing with Martin Luther King and with Bobby Kennedy. And when it was concluded by Hoover that they couldn't be blackmailed, they were targeted for assassination.
Because for Kennedy, he had some Russian mistrust, and for Martin Luther King, it was a problem with Hook. But I know this can be confusing I will develop this for the agent. I agree with you that to find the shooter are not really, the shooter are not really interesting. They're just people mandated to shoot.
They're cutouts, as they call them.
They're just the anti-castrists, and then you can kill them to silence them. It's not.
And no one will know.
Yeah, exactly. So the problem are not the shooter. We had enough evidence to find that the anti-castrists of the Bay of Pigs have been reoriented against Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. But the problem is the top 5 personality involved. We got Bloomfield. Probably you can put McCloy in it, but maybe you got other character like Clint Murchison. Do you believe he was involved in it?
No, I don't think so. I think he was a very loudmouth right-winger who was opposed to John Kennedy, but couldn't command something like that. See, if you're going to carry out an assassination like that, you have to know that you can control law enforcement and investigators. And in this case, it means the FBI. The FBI has to be brought in on it on some level. And that's why Hoover was so important. Because Hoover wasn't going to spill the beans because he had been doing this all along. Whereas someone like Murchison, he doesn't control what the media can do, what the intelligence communities can do, what law enforcement can do. So you have to look at something higher. But if you assume
he can provide money. He can provide money.
Well, he can provide money, and he may have had reasons to want to kill Kennedy. But there are a lot of people who didn't like John Kennedy who didn't have either the connections, the power, or the ability to cover it up.
Okay.
You think about the Warren Commission report. Not everyone on the Warren Commission was controlled or part of the conspiracy. What happened is they were given information by staff that was controlled. And who was the secretary of the Warren Commission? It was Allen Dulles. How do you appoint someone who Kennedy fired for good reason, to
That's
be in
Lyndon
charge.
That's Lyndon and Johnson were pointing him.
That's right. That's right.
So you.
But what did Lyndon Johnson say? He said, "Well, we wanted to make it seem as though it was impartial." So that certainly doesn't hold out, does it?
Well, no. I always believed that Lyndon B. Johnson was a really big part of the assassination due to his profile. A lot of his political career, you got deaf people with, Malcolm Wallace, who was his killer. He has the profile to do such, and he has a lot to hide. But
Boris, let me just say one more thing on that, which is that in the same way that some people say, well, George W. Bush was behind 9/11. First of all, I don't think Bush is smart enough to do something like that. But he probably was not surprised when it happened. Cheney may have been appraised of it. But the fact is that Bush was manipulated very easily to go for a police state after 9/11. Now, in the same way, I'm not convinced Johnson was involved in the assassination of Kennedy, but once it happened, he knew he had to protect the people who were, for his own sake and to avoid chaos. So I think he's culpable, he's guilty of not allowing a full investigation to take place.
So you don't believe the Madeleine Brown version, in fact?
No. And I don't believe, I know my friend Roger Stone is convinced that Lyndon Johnson was responsible for it, but Roger hasn't convinced me of that yet.
Okay, because we can't avoid the fact that the billionaire Hunt financed Lyndon B. Johnson against Kennedy in the primaries Democrat before. And he openly said he participated financially to the assassination of Kennedy. You don't put the billionaire Hunt, Howard Lafayette Hunt, in the top character involved in the assassination?
Well, I don't know enough about him, but if you're asking me my view on this, the operatives who carried it out, who were high enough so they could cover it up, but at the same time had operational capability, would be Bloomfield operating through people like Alan Dulles and the Dulles holdovers in the intelligence community, people like Howard Hunt, where Hunt was not a coordinator of these things, but Hunt ran assassination squads that came out of the Bay of Pigs crisis. He had access to Cuban fighters. As he said, he wasn't involved in it, but he was on the bench in case he was called on. But Hunt's view, and I think he has someone we should listen to on his deathbed, told his son, St. John Hunt, that he believed that William Harvey, who was the interface between the FBI and the CIA in Rome, was involved. Now, Harvey was close to Bloomfield. Harvey was part of the Permindex operation in Rome, because Rome is one of the places where Permindex was chartered. So, I think that this is where you have to look in the intelligence community. And I mentioned this before. There was a report put out called the Torbit Papers by someone who I believe was, that's a pseudonym for someone who was probably a CIA operative, who has a lot of excellent material on going through back to 1962, a meeting in Montego Bay, Jamaica, at Sir William Stevenson's home, which included Bloomfield and included a number of the people we've been discussing, plotting the assassination of Kennedy. Now, the Torbit Papers, though, try to make it seem as though it was the FBI and Hoover that was involved, which is another kind of trick to cover up for the CIA involvement. And Hoover worked very closely with the CIA on these things, just as today Comey and Brennan worked very closely, largely under Brennan's influence, though, John Brennan, in the whole story of Russiagate against Trump. So when it comes to these big fights, there's not that much difference between the top level careerists in the CIA and those in the FBI.
But when you look at the profile of Bloomfield, it was connected because you in the Executive Intelligence Review had a view on the notes of personal agenda of Bloomfield. That's why you find the Bronfman connection, and probably Edmond Safra inside. Can you tell us the specific notes that you saw into the agenda of Bloomfield that his wife cut? He was in his testimony that he wanted to expose it in the Canadian archives, and his wife blocked it. And the Executive Intelligence Review saw it before it was cut. Can you talk about this?
Well, I wasn't one of the ones who saw the archives. My associate, Jeff Steinberg, was the one who had an opportunity to see that. But what it basically shows is that Bloomfield was hyperactive in the period going from October 62 until the assassination a little more than a year later. And that he organized this session in Montego Bay in Jamaica at Sir William Stevenson's resort that included people like Ferenc Nagy, the former agriculture secretary under Mussolini. I forget his name right now. It included this guy Borghese, who was one of the people who ran Nazi networks in the Gladio. And that Bloomfield was constantly on the move. He was in London, he was in Rome, he met with William Harvey. He was back in New Orleans, where he had a meeting with Clay Shaw. And he and Shaw go back long time together, back to World War II and the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. So Bloomfield's profile was not of some guy just sitting on a phone somewhere making calls, getting things done. He was visiting people. He was coordinating things. And he was actually a high-level guy to be on the ground. Usually you think in these kinds of things that, someone's in a bunker somewhere sending out messages. But he was actually making sure that things were in place. And that's what his wife was trying to protect against, the evidence that he had a hands-on control over this network. Now, this is what Garrison didn't fully have when Jim Garrison, the New Orleans attorney, when he carried out his case. I met with Garrison after he wrote the book on the track of the assassins, which became the basis of Oliver Stone's movie JFK. And in the first version of it, he had almost none of the international connections, and we and a few others gave him some more material, and he redid it to include more background on Clay Shaw. But had Jim Garrison had access to the Bloomfield files, he might have been able to convict Shaw, because it was clear that people like the FBI agent we talked about who was in New Orleans.
Bannister? Yeah,
Bannister. That Bannister was in regular meetings with Shaw. That David Ferry was in meetings with Shaw. The cast of characters, including the guy who testified, Russo, the insurance executive who testified and then changed his testimony after he was threatened by Walter Sheridan, who was a top-level asset of this network. Walter Sheridan was hired by NBC to smear Jim Garrison. And what they did is they went around and basically Sheridan told all the people who Garrison was talking to, you'd better not talk to him. You'd better not tell him what you know. And so...
okay, I get the point. So you say that the New Orleans connection of Clay Shaw goes with the connection of Bloomfield, and we found them in Europe against de Gaulle just before. It was the same network. Okay.
And what the network in Europe also intersected the OAS, the operation of the people who said that de Gaulle betrayed them in Algeria, and the Jacques Soustelle networks. And Soustelle has never really been questioned on this, I don't think, or never was questioned on it. But there's an ample evidence that Soustelle, who had been working with de Gaulle during the war, turned on him, and that Soustelle was very much a part of the same network. And again, it was not a local network. It was not a Frenchman against de Gaulle. It was international people who were against de Gaulle, just as it was an international operation against John Kennedy. These things are never small. Whenever you hear about a lone gunman or a loan assassin. If I hear someone talk about a loan assassin, I think about a banker who won't give you a loan. But the idea that there are individuals who can orchestrate these kinds of complex operations, including the getaway and so on, it's just not true. It doesn't happen. And that's why you have to look at the higher levels. And that brings up the real final question. Who benefits? Who benefits from these things? Who benefited from the Kennedy assassination? This is why I brought up what Eisenhower said about the military-industrial complex. That's not just defense contractors. That includes bankers and insurance companies. It includes the contractors who go in and rebuild countries after they're destroyed in war. In the Iraq War, that includes the people who were hired to do a job they never did. They just stole billions of dollars from the U.S. government, supposedly to reconstruct water and power systems, which they never did. The military-industrial complex is who benefits from the constant fight between Ukraine and Russia. The people who want to see NATO spend more money. They want countries in Europe to have to spend more. Now, Trump is doing that because he wants to break up NATO. But the people who are pushing it are the ones who benefit from these things. And that's why they want wars. And that's why Trump's decision to pull troops out of Syria and Afghanistan and to try and resolve the Ukraine situation is a threat to them. And one of the things that we said a long time ago is that had Kennedy been more open in talking about who was threatening him, they might not have been able to kill him. That if you say, look, if something happens to me, here's who to look for. You name your assassin.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Protection.
I agree with you. Many people at the highest level don't have this reaction to name things and to expose it to the public. It's a good protection, in my opinion. It goes in the media with this,
it's a great protection because you're basically saying to someone, if you kill me, I've already told people you're the one who's going to do it.
Yeah,
and that's why Trump is still alive, because he's willing to name the names. And who does he name? He goes to the Clinton networks, the Obama crowd, and the Bush crowd. Remember, he won the presidency by destroying the Bush machine in the Republican Party. And so I think it's important for people to realize that if you want to protect a president, or if Zelensky, for example, wants to survive, he's got to name the Pravi Sector, the Azov Battalion, the neo-Nazis as the ones who are coming to get him, because they are coming after him. They're threatening him.
The problem is to openly talk about things, and this is the problem of the day.
And someone has to say to Adam Schiff, you're threatening the life of President Zelensky by your crazy impeachment efforts against Donald Trump right now.
And if we go back with William Stephenson, it's not so far from the beginning of the WWF, the ecologist movement from the monarchy. I know that you call him the Prince of England is the husband of the Queen,
Prince
right?
Philip, yeah, Prince Philip.
Philip of Mountbatten, right?
Yes, exactly.
He created the ecological movement. But if we dig further inside, we find that it's not far from the club of the 1001. I don't know the English word. It's in French. It's Club des Mille.
Yeah.
Club of 1001.
Yeah.
Or Island Club, the Club des Îles. And among those networks, you also have assassins for the interest of those circles. It's a parallel networks with the same kind of methodology to the interest of some elite circles. Can you develop a little this Jan Fleming, this kind of...
Actually, you know who's even better on that is Jean Le Carré, the English spy novelist, who's written several books about the privatization of intelligence and the fact that you have corporations that are dictating the policies to the intelligence communities, whether it's in Africa or dealing with Russian arms merchants or so on, because that's what it is. I mean, look, who's Prince Philip? Prince Philip is a nobody. He comes from a family of Nazi lovers from Germany. You know, two of his sisters married high-level Nazi officials.
He comes from Greece at the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And
But they married Nazi officials in Germany.
Okay.
Because the Mountbatten it's Greek, but it's also German.
Okay.
Now, Prince Philip is the right person to look at because he once said that the biggest problem facing the world is overpopulation. And he said at a speech to an insurance company in Switzerland, if I could be reincarnated, I'd like to come back as a deadly disease so I could help deal with the problem of overpopulation.
He said this?
He said that, yes.
Okay.
Well, Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, said the same thing. Russell said that wars have been inefficient at reducing population, but a good plague every generation or so would do the job. And he said it might not be pleasant, but it would allow others to then procreate freely. Okay. So you have, this is the old Parson Malthus, the Malthusian view that population is the problem. And why do they think that? Well, they think there are scarce resources and they want to control the resources. That's what an imperial power is all about. And what Mr. Larouche has always taught is that the resources of the world are the minds of the people, the creative capability of people to take something that for one generation is a rock and find out that it's uranium, or the hole in the ground that's producing this substance. It's not water. You're looking for water and it's oil, becomes a resource once you develop the steam engine. So it's the creative power of humanity which enables us to keep providing for a growing population. Instead, virtually all of the elites believe that the world is overpopulated, but they couldn't convince people of that. So what are they saying now? They're saying human society is heating up the planet and we're causing climate change. And they have this completely phony theory about carbon dioxide. And why are they saying this? Well, you've probably heard Greta Thunberg and others say people shouldn't have children because there are too many people. Well, that's just wrong. But the Club of 1001, or the Club of Rome is another one of these, or the Project 2030, they're all based on the idea that we have to deindustrialize and reduce population. And someone like John Kennedy did not support that. Trump doesn't go along with it. I have no idea what Macron thinks about these things, but I know that there's in France you still have, it may be deteriorating, but you still have an infrastructure and an industrial economy. In the United States, we're losing it very rapidly.
We are losing it really rapidly in France because of Sarkozy, Hollande, Macron, who are mandated to do such.
That's right. And Merkel's destroying the German economy by going anti-nuclear, anti-coal, anti-fossil fuel, anti-auto. Now you have farmers demonstrating all over Europe because they're being blamed for climate change because they have cattle or modern farming methods. So it's the same fight that there's always been, an oligarchic elite trying to impose their power over the masses of the population. And they use psychological warfare and brainwashing to do it. And that's why the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination is so important. Virtually every American my age, I'm 70 now, but everyone who was somewhat conscious at the time of the Kennedy assassination knew that the cover-up was on, that the Warren Commission was a cover-up. And yet we've lived with it our whole lives. We've accepted it. When the movie JFK came out, all of a sudden people said, why do you accept this? But nothing was done. Now we've got a fighting chance to reverse this because we have a president who's standing up and fighting against the secret government. He's not perfect. I don't agree with everything Donald Trump does, but I've never seen a president with the guts to tell the New York Times that they're a lying piece of fake news, to attack the media correctly for their cover-up and their lies. And so we have to use this, and hopefully the report that will come out from the Attorney General, William Barr, will show how the CIA and the FBI manufactured these lies about Russian interference to try to stop Trump and to keep a confrontation between the US and Russia. And I think that's the legacy of the Kennedy assassination.
I understand your point of view, but I have a kind of feeling that when I look at Trump, I say he exposed a lot of interesting aspects, but is too. I know I don't know the English word. When you say ambiguous, you got this name, this word.
Ambiguous.
Is too ambiguous on this point. I believe if he had some problem to extract himself from the dumber Republican and Democrat game, it's because it seems he understands many aspects, but he doesn't completely split from this word game.
Well, let me just tell you something from inside the U.S. political situation. It's pretty difficult to find honest people in positions of influence. And when Trump had to bring people into his government, he ended up bringing in a lot of the same bums that were there under Bush and Obama, like Fiona Hill, who's the so-called Russia expert, or keeping William Taylor as the ambassador to Ukraine. These are not good people. They're people who are elites, who think they know better than the president. And Trump has been poorly served by the Republican Party because a lot of the Republicans are neoconservatives who like war. And the Democrats have become neocons now. And then you have the neoliberals who believe that we should have no role for the state in anything. So the corruption is the whole society, and you see it in terms of the leadership. But when you have someone who will fight, you can do one of two things. Either sit back and say, I hope he wins, or you can roll up your sleeves and say, I'm going to do some work to show him who the real enemy is, and hopefully he'll pick up on it. And I've written 30, 40 articles on Russiagate so far that are widely circulated, that people are reading to understand who's running this operation. I even, by the way, wrote an article about how John Kennedy was not a greenie, was not an environmentalist, and would not understand the Democrats today calling for a Green New Deal. So I think what people like I have been doing, the LaRouche movement has been doing, is saying to Trump, we support you against these coup plotters, but here's the program you have to go with to push him further. And if we can get enough of the Trump supporters to go with these programs, then I'll tell you what will happen. The cover will come off Russiagate, but then Trump is going to have to bring the cover off 9/11, the cover off the Iraq War, and he's going to have to also bring out the documents which are still classified from the Kennedy assassination. And he said he was going to do it, and he didn't do it. And that had a lot to do with permanent bureaucrats saying, if you do that, it will lead to too many troubles.
I heard this. Some people were frustrating because the information provided were not really, consistent. And I heard also that they say if the information were released, there will be a high risk for the continuation of the U.S. government. That's what they say in the media, right?
Well, I think what would happen is that Trump would have to have an alternative immediately for the CIA and the FBI. There are good people in these institutions, but the leadership is corrupt. The leadership is rotten. That's what we've learned from Russiagate. And then as you go back from Russiagate and look at all these other scandals and crises, you realize that was the way it was set up. The CIA was created by this British network around Sir William Stevenson. For example, if you want to clean up the CIA, the first thing you have to do is investigate the role of Sir William Stevenson in the way the CIA was organized. And this, just a really quick point, James Angleton was very close friends with a British operative, British spy named Kim Philby, who was a Russian agent. Now, how could Angleton, who was supposedly the top counterintelligence operative in the United States, not know that his good friend and drinking buddy was a Russian agent until after Philby defected? So either he knew something about it and was part of the same higher level game at the top, or else he was incompetent. But in any case, it tells you something about the problem in the intelligence community. And what LaRouche had advised in an article he wrote 20 years ago is you have to dismantle the CIA and build up a real American system intelligence capability with expertise in economics and history, not spying. And I think then, and also don't have Wall Street bankers be brought in to head up your intelligence community.
That's what Kennedy tried to do. I have 3 more questions. You okay?
Well, I have to be quick because I'm running short on time.
Okay. How many time? Tell me. I just.
Why don't you start with your questions and I'll see how quickly I can answer them.
Okay. When you the first question is maybe the most complicated, maybe because it's something personal. But are you good in economy? In economical analysis, is your thing or not?
I've worked with Lyndon Larouche for more than 40 years, and I think he's the best economist in the world. So I'm okay.
You're okay. So,
Yeah.
because it's a economical question, if you want to demonstrate that the Iraq War is responsible for the 2008 economical crisis, I have a personal view on this. You correct me if I'm wrong, because I've worked in some financial issues in the past. It was my job. When a country goes to the war, he has to use his own money and to make some loan. And the consequences of this is the value of his money goes down. And when the United States of America went in war in Iraq, the dollar went down. And as you said, with the Bretton Woods end of agreement, the gold dollar became the oil dollar. So the OPEC and the Arabs that produce oil, when the dollar goes down, they have to raise the price of the barrel. So when the Bush came with his Iraq war, the dollar went down and the barrel went up. For the moment, I'm not wrong, okay? I'm not.
Well, that did happen, but that's not what caused the 2008 crisis.
No. That's just the beginning of the.
That played into it.
Okay, so when the dollar went down and the barrel went up, the director of the Federal Reserve, who was Alan Greenspan at the time, decided to raise up the interest rate of the national on the United States of America
to protect the value of the dollar
market. It chose to protect the company that depended of oil at this time. But in the same time, previously, he incitated the poor people and the middle class to invest it in the real estate segment with the non-protected interest rate. So he chose to help the big company who depended on oil and to let the poor and the middle class with no option. The bank protected itself because they had the ability to get back the houses, but the poor had no option, in fact. So this created in my opinion, the choice of Alan Greenspan to help the company that depended on oil and to betray the others was the origin of the 2008 economical crisis, because the subprime crisis come from those interest rates of the loan that the people cannot pay, and where in the global economical aspect, everything was with obligation and action mixed. So this is the direct problem of the 2008 crisis.
Well, let me go back a step before that, because before the Iraq War in 1999, there was a bill that repealed something called the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, Glass-Steagall separated commercial banking from investment banking, which meant that if you were an investment bank, you could do whatever you want to do, buy and sell risky loans. But if you went bankrupt, the government wouldn't bail you out and you couldn't steal your clients' money. Whereas commercial banks were protected by regulatory laws. When that was repealed, that meant that investment banks could merge with commercial banks and could use their depositors' money as collateral toward leveraged loans. And so they were creating huge volumes of loans that ended up going into real estate, into housing. And so this was happening before the Iraq War. Now, the Iraq War played into it because it increased government debt quite a bit. But household debt was increased by the idea that if housing prices keep going up, you can get a second mortgage on your home and have all this money to play with, and you'll be able to pay it off in the future because the price of your home will go up. It was a bubble. Greenspan created a bubble. What you described was part of it, but the bubble really goes back to the 71 decision by Nixon and the systematic destruction of the banking regulation in the United States, in which the repeal of Glass-Steagall is the final straw. Now, here's the kicker to that. After the 2008 crisis, what did we do? Did we stop speculation? Did we make banks stop stealing their depositors' money or do bailouts or bail-ins? No, we accelerated it. So today, the total volume of debt is 40% higher than it was in 2008. In the United States, corporate debt is at $15 trillion, and half of that is junk bond debt, which means it's not worth anything. Consumer debt is $14 trillion. Government debt is $24 trillion. And meanwhile, we're having low interest rates bailing out the speculators. So it's worse today than it was in 2008. And the broader point, which I agree with you on, is that the people making policy don't give a damn whether people can pay their bills at the end of the month. They're trying to make sure there's a flow of credit that goes to the speculators so they can keep the bubble going. And as with every bubble in history, it's going to pop. Now, the question is this time when it pops, are they going to bail out the speculators and screw the people? Or will the people finally stand up and say, no, we're not going to let you bail out these speculators. They have to go to jail. So that's going to be the issue in the months ahead, because we're at a point where the bubble can't be sustained.
You think there is a high risk of a big economical crisis more than ever?
Oh, we're already in it. You know, if you read what Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, is saying, or what Christine Lagarde is saying, they're saying we need more credit. The whole issue around the European Stability Fund and will we establish a common banking law for Europe? That's all about the fact that the banks are in terrible shape. Deutsche Bank is a disaster, but also Crédit Agricole, BNP Paribas, they're involved in this repo loans. They're not loaning money to their customers anymore because they're holding it to protect their own derivative obligations. So I think we're heading towards something that will be bigger than 2008. One of the dangers is that if it looks like Trump is going to win, Wall Street may pull the plug on the whole stock market and let the bubble pop so Trump won't win. So I think Trump has to move to preempt it. What he should do, and by the way, there's some people in France, including my friend Jacques Cheminade, who ran for president several times in France, is advocating return to Glass-Steagall regulation, including in France. Get rid of this idea of universal banking and go back to where you have the savings banks, the local and regional banks that are protected, and the investment banks are not protected, and then the big commercial banks have to choose. Do they want to make their money through trading or through investment in the real economy?
Okay. So a last question about Bloomfield, and then we can conclude with Jacques Cheminade and the French that are close to your movement. So about Bloomfield, I've read an article on Executive Intelligence Review. He defended the interest of Lord Rothschild in his past, and he was a close friend to Ben-Gurion. Will you say that with the Tricontinental, it was a project through the IFA, well, I don't have the English word for this, but I will provide the information to the audience more further. So when you look at the nuclear program of Israel inside this geopolitical game, what is the importance of this? Will you say that this is the end of this military complex? This is the Jew part of the movement we are criticizing, with what we said. You have a Jew movement that match with what we are criticizing in the English legacy.
Well, I think Bloomfield was pretty much true to the Zionist policy toward Israel, which is that Israel was built up as a military state, as a placekeeper in the Middle East. And the whole idea was that initially that the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews would provide an entry point for the British and the French and the Americans to go in and straighten things out. The turning point came in 1956 when the Israelis invaded Sinai and tried to take the Suez Canal with British and French support. French and British soldiers went, and the British Prime Minister said to Eisenhower, "You should join us." And Eisenhower said, "You should stop this right away, or we're going to have terrible sanctions economic sanctions against Britain." And the British and the French backed off, and the Israelis did also. That was the point at which the decision was made by the French to provide the technology for the Israeli bomb. And because Israel has a nuclear weapon, which they deny, or they don't talk about, they never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. So you have a certain kind of force for this globalist British policy in the Middle East under what I would say is a very unstable bully, Netanyahu. And Netanyahu goes back to the extreme revisionist wing of Zionism tied to Jabotinsky, which believed that greater Israel is from the Nile to the Tigris-Euphrates. And this is what we're seeing with the West Bank is just the starting point. But I don't believe most Israelis support that. And I think the last election showed that Netanyahu can't get elected anymore. Whether there can be a solution in Israel, it's hard to say. But Bloomfield, throughout his career, was very much involved with defending and supporting the idea that the Israelis have a right to this land and a right to, and I don't just mean the actual physical land of Israel, but as much as they want to take. And Bloomfield worked with major charities that provided lots and lots of money for Israel, including for weapons and building new settlements and things of that sort.
Okay. So we got to finish with maybe some words for Jacques Cheminade and the French movement that match with Lyndon Larouche legacy.
Well, Jacques Cheminade is an economist. He went through the top schools in France, and he was working at the French legation at the United Nations when he met Larouche. And he's now run for president, I think, 3 times in France. And each time he's presented an alternative which is close to the Gaullist idea that instead of the European Union as it's constituted, that there should be a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals of sovereign nation states which work together on bilateral and multilateral basis for trade and economic development. And that France has a scientific tradition that must be protected and advanced. Jacques, in his last campaign, talked about going to Mars. And the media made fun of that, even as the European Space Agency is negotiating to work with Russia and the United States and China to go to Mars. So Jacques was targeted by the French security, by the French deep state, you might say. He was accused of illegally taking a loan in one campaign. They took his house from him. He's been given a very rough time by the legal authorities. But each time he runs for president, he's able to get the signature of at least 500 mayors who want him on the ballot for president. So I think
he will run again, you think?
Well, probably. I think he's about 74 years old right now, but he's someone who, I'll just give you an example. When I spent some time in 1984 with Jacques, it was the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. And Jacques took me to meet a friend of his, and her name was Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, one of the leaders of the resistance movement. And she introduced me to a number of top people, including Chirac. And Jacques is well known among French intellectuals, French political figures, but because of all the slanders against Lyndon Larouche, and by the way, the slanders come from the same people who killed Kennedy and are attacking Trump. In fact, The prosecutor in the Larouche case in the United States in 1988 that sent Larouche to prison, the prosecutor was named Robert Mueller, the same Robert Mueller of the Mueller report against Trump. So Jacques is a target by those same networks. But I think our movement in France, Solidarité et Progrès, is growing. It's got some support. And I would encourage your viewers to check us out and look up Jacques Cheminade and see what he's doing and saying. He's a very prolific writer. And maybe you want to interview him at some time, Boris. I think you'd find him very interesting.
Why not? I want to thank you very, very much for the time you gave us and to my audience. And I wish you the best for your project with the Larouche Legacy or your own project. And I hope to see you in the next future for a good idea or recommendation. If you have some things to express, don't hesitate to come. I will let you speak as you wish.
Well, I'm in the Berlin area. I'm not too far from France, so I have an invitation from Jacques to come to France at some point in the near future. So maybe we can sit down and have a glass of wine together.
Maybe, I hope so. Thank you very much. And I wish you the best for the next.
Okay, thank you.
Goodbye.